Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, which is focusing on Australia-China relations during a time of rising tensions between Beijing and Washington. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Linda Jakobson, founding director and deputy chair of China Matters. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and recognize continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm very delighted that we have three knowledgeable, experienced panelists to discuss this issue. In alphabetical order, Michael Clifton, CEO of China Matters. Michael's a Mandarin speaker and has had a very diverse career, including almost 20 years in trade and defense appointments across Asia and the Middle East. Dennis Richardson, AC, who before retirement a few years ago was Secretary of the Department of Defense. And when he retired, he ended a stellar career in both foreign affairs and defense. And the third panelist, Peter Varghese, currently Chancellor of the University of Queensland. He too, a former Secretary of DFAT with a distinguished foreign affairs career behind him. Peter penned the most recent China Matters Explorers policy brief. What should Australia do to manage risk in its relationship with the people? If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. It's on our website, chinamatters.org.au. And I think the policy brief will inform our discussion today. Now, I've asked the panelists to speak for about 6 to 7 minutes each. I'll then probe further with them for about 10 minutes, after which I'm going to open up the discussion to your questions. We have a full house today. If we were in a conference hall, I'd say it would be overflowing. We're nearly at 300 people who have registered. We have a lot of pre-submit questions. I invite you to continue to submit questions as the panelists speak. So please feel free to use the Q&A button. We're going to wrap up very promptly at 4 p.m. So now I'll ask Peter to start, then we'll go to Dennis, and thirdly to Michael. Peter, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Linda, and thank you for the invitation to participate today. And I'm delighted to be joining Dennis and Michael on this panel. I thought I'd just expand a little bit on some of the key points in the paper to which you referred that I did for China Matters. And the first thing I'd say is that engagement with China today is a necessary condition for our policy towards China, but it is no longer a sufficient condition for how we deal with China. The case for engagement is an obvious case. I mean, China is a significant economic and a strategic power. It's not going away. It's going to retain its political character, its authoritarian political character for the foreseeable future. And we have to deal with it. We have to deal with it, engage with it, not only because we have important bilateral interests engaged, but also because all of those broader global issues that require a measure of global cooperation are not going to go away. If anything, they're going to get more significant. So I think the case for engagement, particularly economic engagement, is fairly straightforward. And bear in mind that while we're entering into a very uncertain global economic period, a global recession for certain, the best estimates are still that in terms of new purchasing power, China out to about 2030 will be stronger than the US, Japan, Indonesia, and India combined in terms of new purchasing power. Now, I think the reason why engagement is no longer a sufficient condition rests primarily on China's strategic posture and its strategic ambitions. China is looking to be the predominant power in the Indo-Pacific at the least. And that is not an attractive aspiration from an Australian perspective, or I suspect from the perspective of a number of other countries. Why does China's ambition for predominance become problematic? It's not because that indicates that China will be an enemy of Australia or an enemy of friends and allies, but it does mean that a predominant China will have the largest single measure of influence on the rules of our region, the strategic culture of our region, and as a norm setter. And I don't think it is in Australia's interests for an authoritarian system to have that reach. And so the question is, how do we ensure, to the extent any of us can ensure anything, that they are constraints placed on China's behavior when it acts in a way which is unacceptable, whether that is coercive behavior or whether it's behavior that flies in the face of international norms or international law. And that's why in my paper, I try to build a case for an engage and constrain framework. The constrained part of it is obviously the harder part of it. And ultimately, what we're looking for is a measure of collective pushback when China does behave in unacceptable ways. And I think we need to try and reach a position where leverage in relationships is not just a case of China utilizing its economic weight to exercise leverage, but that leverage becomes a two-way street. Now, how you construct a constrainment framework is obviously a very, very large challenge. It is not something that will happen quickly. I think we do have some platforms that we can build on, of which, in my view, the Quad, bringing together the US, Japan, India, and Australia, is probably the most significant, and adding to that other countries who, for their own reasons, also share a collective unease at the thought of China having a clear run to predominance, and whether that is a significant country like Indonesia or a country like South Korea in Northeast Asia, I think is a very open question. I think the appetite for collective pushback is going to grow, not least because China's behavior is going to encourage a greater interest in collective pushback. I mean, at the moment, quite remarkably, in my view, China is taking simultaneously a tough line on the South China Sea, the East China Sea, on Hong Kong, and across the Indian border. And the more the countries of the region observe this behavior, the more I think they will be interested in finding a mechanism for dealing with it. I suspect one of the consequences of the tension on the India-China border is going to be less ambivalence on the part of India in terms of the Quad, and probably a speeding up of India's strategic reorientation towards a much closer strategic relationship to the US and to Japan and to countries like Australia. Still well short of an alliance, but I think quite different to the traditional India obsession with keeping all your options open. I think India might discover the hard way that sometimes options need to be exercised rather than constantly kept open. So that's the engage and constrain framework. Just a couple of other very quick points, if I may, Linda. Obviously, this question of trade dependency on China is on a lot of people's minds. I mean, the point about a global economy is that it's a case study in economic interdependence. And so if we want to address issues of trade, trade dependence on China, we need to recognize that unpicking a global economy is a very complicated exercise. I think decoupling China from the global economy makes no economic or strategic sense for a country like Australia to decouple your largest trading partner. I think it underestimates the complexity of doing it. I mean, in many ways, these are almost Siamese twin type relationships, and surgery is not straightforward. I think in the end, what we need is a framework which looks to diversify trade relationships, but not to divert trade relationships. I don't think consciously diverting trade away from China would be in our interests, but clearly building trade with other countries, whether it's India or Japan or the US or a post-Brexit UK or any other number of markets makes a lot of sense. And the last point I would make is that there is, in my view, a real risk that the United States may end up embracing a policy of containment. I don't think US policy is actually settled on this. They have strayed from engagement, but I don't think they've quite worked out what's going to replace it or what they will add to it. And for all of the reasons I spoke about in terms of decoupling, I think containment would be the wrong policy. Containment seeks to thwart China, which in the long term I don't think is a sensible policy position, as opposed to managing the relationship. I think the choice between decoupling and engagement ought to tilt strongly towards engagement. So I'll conclude my comments there, Linda.
Thank you, Peter. Dennis?
Linda, look, I don't have a lot to say by way of intro. Happy to take part in the discussion that follows. I was always fond of saying when people would ask me about Australia, the US and China, I would always say, look, can be summarised very simply friends with both, allies with one. Over coffee a couple of weeks ago, Alan Gingell said to me, look, you've always said that. That's no longer. Time's marched on. That's no longer. It's a worthwhile objective, but it's no longer an accurate descriptor. And that's spot on. I think even what we might have thought in terms of what was possible a year ago is probably not possible today. In terms of the global regional dimensions, I don't disagree with anything Peter has said. Bilaterally, I agree that there is a limit to the extent that you can decouple, although I do think we may see a decoupling in the technological sphere. I think we may well see a push by the US for countries to be less dependent on the US, on China technologically and their systems and the like. Whether it's possible to do that, I simply don't know enough about it. I think there's not a lot of initiatives the Australian government can take at the moment. In the regional sphere there is, and I agree with what Peter is saying on that. Bilaterally, I think the scope for initiatives is fairly limited. And indeed, given the fact that China very publicly refused to talk to the trade minister and refused to talk to others over the last couple of months in respect of barley and other trading matters, I think the Australian government would be selling itself short if it continued to publicly seek meetings with China's leaders. So I think we're in a period where I think probably we've got to let things settle. We've certainly got to manage a way forward. as productively and constructively as we can. But I think to let things settle for a while is probably the springboard for doing something more positive down the track. Whether we're able to do that, I don't know, because we're going to have we've got big differences on the South China Sea. We're going to have big differences on Hong Kong. I think it's going to be difficult for the government not to do something in respect of people in Hong Kong who might want to come to Australia in current circumstances. The Chinese have shown a propensity to want to punish those who act contrary to its perceived interests. The final thing I might make, I think we need to be careful in overstating the significance of China being authoritarian. I think this comes down to China was authoritarian in a one-party state in 1972. It was during the Hawke and Howard years and Keating years. And don't forget that we have a relatively close relationship with Vietnam, which is equally authoritarian, equally one party, and is equally prepared to crush internal dissent as what China is. So I think there's an element here that does flow over from the fact that China is authoritarian, but I think there's a lot of just real hard-nosed, real politic in it all. That's all I've got to say by way of intro, Linda.
Thank you. Dennis, Michael?
Thanks, Linda. And they are two very difficult acts to follow, but I'll do my best. I'm going to address myself to three areas. The level of engagement in the China debate by Australia's business leaders, the issue of market diversification and decoupling, which Peter has already covered to a certain extent, and then the absence of an effective business-to-business dialogue between Australia and China. So I'll start with the question of where are the business voices in Australia, and my proposition is that Australian business has been overly cautious in its response to the crisis in the relationship. And unless business is prepared to accept the freeze in relations as an enduring feature of the relationship, it hopefully will find a more assertive voice. Now, at present, senior business leaders seem either conspicuously absent, or they're being swept aside in what has become quite a toxic environment. Now, that said, I'd welcome today's interim report from the Asia Business Task Force, which is co-sponsored by the BCA, and that's a welcome injection of business views into the Asia/China debate. The level of engagement with Australia's most important commercial partner, I think, falls well short of the intensity with which we are engaging with our other partners, the US, Japan, Europe, etc. Now, having said that, that's in no small part due to the fact that China and the hardening of attitudes in Beijing Beijing seems determined to leave Australia in the diplomatic sin bin. Nonetheless, hopefully we can navigate a way towards engagement. No one would suggest that we bend to the economic coercion being applied by China, but a more finely tuned balance between our competing, or not competing, but complementary security and commercial interests requires, I think, business to be a little more forward-leaning in the relationship. It's a subject on which Australian business has the right and the obligation to be heard, but unfortunately the current climate has become such that when a business leader does speak his or her mind, they are almost immediately impugned, and commentators are quick to blur the line between self-interest and the national interest. As Richard Maud has said, we're best served when there's a diversity of voices being heard. At the moment, the voices of what I'll loosely call the security and defence community seem to be more prominent in media circles than are the voices of business. That said, again, I have to acknowledge that on occasion, some business leaders do make it quite easy for the critics to blur that line between self-interest and the national interest. In my view, the two are not mutually exclusive, and we too often forget that for every billionaire mining magnate, there are thousands and thousands of small Australian companies that depend on the China market for their livelihoods. They deserve, in my view, far better than to be airily dismissed as some form of self-interested, quote, pro-Beijing lobby, end quote. In relation to market diversification and supply chains, Peter's sort of covered that, but I'll just draw on an organisation called Macro Polo, who released some research recently suggesting that despite all the talk of decoupling, supply chains in East Asia are actually proving to be quite resilient. The pandemic is proving to be more of a disruption to human activity than it is to the supply chain ecosystem of factories and logistics infrastructure across East Asia. So despite all the media commentary about decoupling, at this stage, what we're seeing is supply chain decoupling happening everywhere, quote, except in the numbers. The evidence doesn't back up the assumption that decoupling is happening as a natural reaction to COVID and the issues with China. So it is early days, but companies are perhaps less exercised about China's reliability as a supplier than the media and other commentators might have us believe. I'm not going to go to the market diversification issue. Peter's covered most of that. I will just say that Peter has used a term in his paper, and Jennifer Westacott has used the same term, and that is to encourage people increasingly to drop the term diversification and talk more about market expansion. And again, in that interim report from the Asian Society today, they encourage the use of the language of it's China and as opposed to China or. And unfortunately, diversification carries with it an implication that we're moving away from a market. And that is not, as Peter has indicated, in our national interest. Just in closing, Linda, a few brief words on business-to-business dialogue. The China-Australia CEO Roundtable was established back in 2007, and it's really the centerpiece for business-to-business exchange with China. But that roundtable is only convened in the margins of senior leader visits. And the last one was held over 3 years ago during the visit of Premier Li Keqiang here to Sydney. Now that's a pretty sorry state of affairs and quite a stark contrast with the business-to-business engagement with other key partners, the US, Europe, the UK, Japan, etc. As the Trade Minister, Mr. Birmingham, said at the National Press Club recently, we can't solve problems if we're not talking to one another. So if and when Australia and China are talking again, a more effective, more regular business-to-business dialogue should be a very important part of that future landscape. And on that note, Linda, I'll say no more.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for your opening comments. I thought I'd go back to some of the things you've said, and hopefully you'll also have a chance to comment on each other. Before I start, and I'm going to ask Peter the first question, but Dennis, you've gone a little dark. We can hardly see you. Have you switched off the lights or something in the room? Because you were very light to begin with, and now you're sitting like in a very dark, much better. Thank you. So Peter, one of the key arguments in your policy brief is this idea that collectively the region's nations are going to push back on the coercive behavior of the PRC. Perhaps for differing reasons, but as the PRC annoys each state more and more, creates a lot of discontent and disharmony, there'll be a willingness to work together. And you use the expression, this will increase the appetite for collective action. I agree with you that Australia alone cannot manage or constrain, as you put it, Beijing's behavior. And it's a really important thing that it's multilateral, any effort to constrain and manage this relationship with Beijing. But I want to point out that at the moment and in the foreseeable past, no country has ever stuck out their necks when Beijing has expressed wrath and punished economically a country. So no one helped South Korea when, after the THAAD missile decision was taken, to use a colloquial expression, Beijing clobbered the South Korean with several different economic punishments. No one at the moment is standing up for Australia when we're beginning to see the coercive measures being taken against Australia. So I suppose my question is, as there's not that solidarity now, but you envision that it will come as Beijing's behavior causes more and more discontent, what action by the PRC, in your view, will it take to gain that solidarity among this region's nations?
Well, I agree with you, Linda, that up to now, the case for collective action has been largely missing. But I think, you know, things here could move reasonably quickly. I mean, Dennis said, you know, what people thought even a year ago may be different today. And I suspect the environment we're dealing with in the next 12 to 24 months could look quite different. What does China need to do? Well, I think if China continues to do what it is doing now, more countries are going to ask themselves the question, how can we deal with this in any other way than through a measure of some collective pushback? Because with the exception of the United States, you're quite right. I mean, no country, I think, is capable by themselves of constraining China. So if China has decided to go down a more assertive foreign policy, if they think the correlation of forces are moving in their direction, if they've made a judgment that the rate of decline of US predominance is more rapid than anyone had thought, and they therefore think that the opportunity arises to push on all fronts in pursuit of their broader strategic ambitions, then I think this will inevitably create a backlash which will shape a more conducive environment for collective action. So it's a judgment about what's to come. I agree, Linda, but I don't think the past here is a sure guide to the way countries are going to think about China into the future.
Is there any specific action that you already now could imagine which would be the spark, be the propelling force to bring these countries together? An action by the PRC that would be so upsetting that people would want to collaborate, want to stick their neck out?
I don't think it would necessarily be China opening up a completely new front, as it were. I think it would be the way in which China pursues an existing agenda. So the level of coercion that it might apply, the degree of assertiveness in its posture, as they increase, as I suspect they may, I think that will have an impact on the way other countries see China. I mean, if you just look at the way in which economic leverage now is being used by China against Australia, it is already, in my view, of a different order to what we had in the past. Now, some of that is bluster, quite a lot of it is bluster, but not all of it is bluster, as we've seen with the barley tariffs and the meat restrictions. So, you know, this is a pattern of behaviour which, in my view, seems to be getting entrenched, and I don't think there are going to be many countries that are comfortable with that trajectory.
Okay, thank you. Dennis, I was really happy to hear you speak about this question of authoritarian China and point out how many authoritarian countries we have in the region. So that leads me to ask you, as a follow-on on what we've just been talking about with Peter, what should Australia do when the middle powers with whom we really want to cooperate, we want support from in constraining the PRC, in moderating the PRC behavior, when they themselves then engage in behavior that's against Australian values? I'm thinking, for example, of anti-Muslim campaigns in India, enforcing the death penalty in Indonesia. These are countries, India and Indonesia, which Peter in his policy brief envisions as part that new strategic equilibrium. What should Australia then do? And you mentioned Vietnam quite rightly.
Oh, I don't think you'll. It's always a mix of values and realpolitik interests and the like. We have never allowed values to dictate the tenor and tone of our relationship, say, for instance, with Indonesia. We've had differences with Indonesia on human rights issues. We've been critical of Indonesia in respect of certain values issues, but we have never allowed it to dictate the core of the relationship. In the same way with India, our mix of interests with India go well beyond taking a holier-than-thou approach in terms of some specific policy issues they might pursue domestically. I don't see. I don't have a problem, and I don't see a contradiction between values, because values are a more important divide between us and China than what they are between us and India and us and Indonesia. And I think that's the way it's always been. That's simply the way the world works.
Okay. Michael, what do you think should be done to entice business leaders to speak up, not only about the need to maintain a healthy relationship with Beijing, to quote John Howard in this morning's newspapers, but also what can be done to have them speak up about the importance of economic security to national security and national interests?
Oh, I don't have the magic solution to the problem, Linda, but a more civil public discourse would be a useful starting point, as I said. For a business leader to speak up in defense of or in support of our commercial interests with China should not ipso facto make that person somehow disloyal to the country or simply looking for their own self-interest. That reflects poorly on the quality of commentary, and it doesn't encourage leaders to speak up. And I've made the point before that it's okay for business to keep their heads down while the level of trade continues to be very, very positive. It's understandable they would choose not to expose themselves to that sort of personal attack in the media and from other channels. They'll keep their head down. But and we're in an environment now where the atmosphere or the environment is no longer as positive as it once was, and business needs to be encouraged to speak out in a way they haven't been accustomed to because they haven't needed to. But at the moment, we do have a debate that is very strong on the defence and security interests for all sorts of eminently understandable and defensible reasons. But that side of the equation is not being as equally balanced with voices speaking up on behalf of our commercial interests. There are voices out there, but they're primarily in academia, pointing out the need for balance between the both. And there are very few business leaders out there who carry the clout to be able to engage in a debate without being slapped down. I won't name names, but ideally we would nurture a generation of business leaders who feel sufficiently comfortable with China to be able to speak out without exposing themselves to public opprobrium.
Linda, can I make comment on that? I think,
Yes.
Look, personal comments. First of all, I think business leaders have, one, they need to have more confidence.
Yep.
Secondly, they need to stop saying silly things. For instance, for business leaders to stand up, as they've done for 10 years, and say, we need to show China more respect. For Twiggy Forrest to do what he did with the health minister. Quite frankly, that sort of behaviour is just dumb. Equally, I think business leaders need to have the confidence to openly say, look, my self-interest also serves the national interest. I mean, if I was a billionaire and I was exporting billions of tonnes of iron ore to China every year, and some journalist said to me, or some critic said to me, look, you're only articulating that view because of your own financial self-interest, I'd turn around and say, too damn right I am. And let me tell you how my financial interest serves the national interest. It provides X amount of revenue to the West Australian state government. It provides X amount of revenue to the federal government, which enables the federal government to spend money on A, B, C, D, and it provides X thousands of jobs. I just find it. I suspect the business community, he says outrageously, needs a little bit of advice in this area. I don't think in Australia they're used to being in this area, and I think they're sometimes their own worst enemy. Finally, they should never take any implication that they are less patriotic than other people. And where their patriotism is called into question, they ought to punch the accuser right on the nose, figuratively, that is. Too often, when their patriotism is called into question, they slink away and you don't hear from them for a month. So I think there's a lot of different things that I think the business community could do in terms of its own interests. But anyway, I'll simply leave it at that.
Dennis, could I just say we're in furious agreement, and that's the point, that those voices are not out there saying the things and doing the things that you've just described, and we need to encourage them to be able and willing to speak up.
Thank you both. Now, participants, we're going to go to your questions. I'm going to be taking the prerogative of the moderator to also combine a few. There's many themes in here. We've got probably about 50 questions, so we're only going to get to a few of them. I apologize ahead of time if your question won't be answered. First question for both Peter and Dennis. Either of you are welcome to answer because there are so many. It's on Taiwan. With what is happening in Hong Kong, it's quite understandable that there is a concern that Xi Jinping is going to start enacting measures to fulfill what he has already said in public, and that is we cannot leave the Taiwan question to next generations. So my question here is, what should Australia's position be, excuse me, if Xi Jinping starts squeezing Taiwan, using all means short of war, with the aim of bringing the Taiwanese leadership to its knees to agree to reunification talks? Because that is his goal. Not necessarily that he will oversee reunification, but that he will be able to say that he went down in history as the man who started the process of reunification. So I'm not here talking about outright invasion. I'm talking about taking out the lights, taking out the communication, possibly a semi-blockade, at the same time conducting missile exercises. A missile goes astray and kills a group of Taiwanese. These kind of measures short of war. What should Australia's position be if this happens? Peter? Do you want to try and take a stab at this?
You're on mute, Peter.
Okay.
Sorry, my apologies. Look, Taiwan's one of those issues which could become a very genuine flashpoint in the region, because it seems to me that the prospect of Taiwan agreeing to join mainland China is receding rather than gaining. And so the choices facing the Chinese leadership are going to become more and more stark. From an Australian perspective, I think the principle that Taiwan's future can be resolved in any way other than peacefully should be the starting point of how we would react to a Chinese policy of intimidation of Taiwan, even if it's intimidation that falls well short of invasion. And it goes back to what we've been talking about earlier, which is this use of coercive and intimidatory behavior by China to achieve its broader strategic objectives. And I think it's important that Australia is very clear in articulating its own position of what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. And I think it also reinforces the point I made earlier, which is if we want to have any prospect of shaping China's behavior, the more we can do so from a collective standpoint as opposed to individual voices, the better. And so I would apply that to a pattern of Chinese behavior down the track vis-a-vis Taiwan as I would to Chinese behavior in other parts of the region or the world.
I'm going to follow up on that with a question to Dennis. There's a lot of questions among our participants about pushback. This is obviously a situation where multilaterally Australia would want to join in and push back. Peter, in his policy brief, speaks about freedom of navigation, patrols, joint letters condemning human rights abuses, and so on. But personally, I don't think these measures are enough to push back if we really want to deter, to constrain Beijing's behavior. What kind of measures would multilaterally Australia, in your view, join in on to push back on aggression, the kind of aggression I was talking about, not military invasion, but aggression nonetheless by Beijing on Taiwan? What are the new types of pushback you envision? Because many of our participants today would like to hear from both of you on what more can Australia and others together do?
Well, I mean, we're not doing a lot collectively at the moment. I would have thought there's a whole lot more we could do. The Quad is in its infancy, and I would note that India, Japan, the US and Australia are members of the G20 and the East Asia Summit, as is Indonesia. I would hope over time we could bring Indonesia in with the other four. When I say into a loose collection of countries that talk about regional issues together, might from time to time engage in some military training together. For instance, there's Indian naval exercises that take place in the Bay of Bengal, which the US take part in. We've sought to join that. Up until recently, I don't think we've been able to. I think there's, you know, you don't, collective action and collective pushback doesn't mean that you roll up your sleeve and you physically, you know, push back. It is doing things together which don't necessarily include China. And I think the message is given and the message is received.
And you're confident, or you think that Beijing will modify its behaviour on the basis of this pushback?
It may not at all, and it may not modify its actions at all. But being a big power, big great powers always like to deal bilaterally with other countries. They like to deal bilaterally with other countries because they know they can always outmuscle other countries bilaterally. What China doesn't want to see is other countries come together in informal ways. Now, that doesn't mean that'll necessarily modify their behaviour, but it certainly is a demonstration that other countries do consider that they have some common interests, both to talk about and to act on. And it's simply a message to China that taking us on individually may or may not work. You'd include South Korea in that. That may look like containment. I don't know. But I don't think you push back. Modifying China's behaviour may be one outcome, but pushback can be an end in its own, right.
Oh, very interesting thought. Peter, did you have anything to add to this pushback theme, which after all is a central part of your paper?
Well, only to say, Linda, that I think what we and others might be prepared to do into the future could be quite different to what we've been prepared to do up to now. For example, on the South China Sea, Australia has, for entirely understandable reasons, been excessively careful not to conduct a freedom of navigation exercise within 12 nautical miles of disputed islands. The case for looking again at that, if Chinese behavior continues to go down a more intimidatory or a coercive path, I think becomes stronger. Similarly, if China were to impose an air defense zone in a way which was contrary to international practice or international law, I think the idea of whether it's the Quad countries or a group of other countries, making it very clear that they will not abide by the air defense zone, I think would send a very strong message. I just think the appetite for doing something that in the past we were very wary of doing is going to change.
Thank you. Michael, I have a question for you from one of our participants today. Have you any comment on the News Corp story that government has decided to withhold all funding from China Matters and scrapped China Matters DGR status?
Well, my first comment would be to say that I would prefer that as few people as possible actually read the story, but given that it's been written, look, let's set aside the nonsensical claim that China Matters works to advance a Beijing agenda and just focus on the two issues you've raised, government funding withdrawal and DGR status. In relation to government funding, as yet we are unaware of any whole of government edict saying to government departments that they shall not continue funding arrangements with China Matters. That said, however, the fiscal pressures on the government are very, very real, and our level of, we anticipate there will be a significant drop in government funding. Now, final decisions are still outstanding from the likes of PM&C and one or two others. So there is very real pressure, but no whole of government decision that we're aware of. The DGR issue, designated gift recipient issue, is more problematic because we did notice quite some time ago that despite being approved for DGR status in the budget papers, we mysteriously were dropped from the enabling legislation. Now, despite multiple approaches to the relevant minister, in this case, Michael Sukkar, we know only that what we've read in the Daily Telegraph. If indeed the government has made a decision to reverse its previous position, no one in government as yet has had the courage or the courtesy to relay that decision to China Matters. Now that's a tad blunt, but I'm struggling to put it in a more gentle form of words. So we seem to have lost DGR, but no one's actually told us that as yet.
How long ago were you in touch with the Assistant Treasury?
I wrote to the Assistant Minister back on the 26th of May, actually, so it's almost 6 weeks ago. No response at all. I've called the office on several occasions. No one has seen fit to return my call, so we're getting the silent treatment for reasons which remain somewhat of a mystery to me.
Okay, back to China. There are several questions about the question of engagement. Obviously, that too was a central theme, Peter, in your paper, the need to continue to want to engage with China. But as one of our participants writes, China is showing less interest in engaging with Australia. What do you think is the reason? And what should be done to be able to restart engagement? First to Peter and then to Dennis.
Well, I think China is showing less interest because China would like to see us shift our policy positions in a number of ways, whether it's what we've done with foreign interference, whether it's what we've done with Huawei. There's a long list of things, I think, which China feels Australia has taken the wrong path. There is no surefire way of guaranteeing a resumption of, for example, high-level contacts with China. Although I think the less we look to be pleading for it, the better in terms of how we deport ourselves internationally. But I think if we do want to have a constructive but realistic long-term relationship with China, which I believe we should, one of the ways of getting there is to have a very clear position and framework for how we will relate to China and what are our red lines and what are areas where we think we can constructively work together. So I think, the more we can put together and articulate a policy framework with that clarity, and then have the fortitude to stick by it, I think that's a better way to try and get re-engagement than perhaps some of the things that we've seen in the more immediate past. Because I think China, at the end of the day, recognizes when a country is not for turning on a particular issue, whether they agree with it or don't agree with it. And they may put us in the freezer for a period because of what we've done. But I think the worst thing we can do is to shift a position that's in our national interest simply because we are on the receiving end of the heat of China.
Thank you, Dennis. Oh, look, I'd agree with what Peter said. I just add a couple of other comments. With Huawei and foreign interference, the issue there was the fact that we were global leaders to some extent, and it had global ripple effects. And that's what China, I think, disliked amongst all things. What we can do at the moment, there'd be a good case for not particularly trying anything at the moment. If we're in the freezer, we're in the freezer. I don't think we should panic over that. I would note that in 1998 or thereabouts, after the election of the Howard government, the Chinese government, in very different circumstances, had question marks about Australian foreign policy and engagement with China. They sent out to Australia their Minister for State Security. He travelled to Australia under an assumed name, under an ordinary passport with a couple of other people. And this is all public now, so I'm not revealing anything that's not out there. He met primarily with Alexander Downer. He also met with other people, including myself. I was then in ASIO. If you wanted to reach out and try something, you might consider going through that quarter. But I think it's very important in this climate for us not to be seen to be over anxious. It's a pretty unhealthy thing when you see a prime ministerial press conference and you see a few journalists from China turn up. They're perfectly welcome to, but they're taking photographs of the Australian journalists who are there. And then when the cameras are turned on them, they behave in a manner which is surprising, to say the least. Now, when you've reached that point, I think you need to be very firm in your own mind about your own interests, and you need to ask yourself the question: is this the time to be seeking to reach out and engage, or is this the time to simply let things sit for a while? And I'm just not quite sure of what the answer is, because I don't think the Australian government would have an interest in reaching out in some private way only for the Chinese to expose that publicly and embarrass the government. Nor do I think an Australian government should put itself in that position. So I think silence in the relationship may be what we have over the next few months. And I don't think we should be searching for some grand initiative.
I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our hour. I think this was a very insightful conversation. I myself would have had one more question for each of you, but I will keep them for our next webinar, and hopefully we'll have you on board again at some point. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, participants. I'm sorry I didn't get to so many of your questions. A lot of very good questions did come in. Thank you for joining China Matters today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.